Good morning, or evening for us. It's definitely evening for us. I am so thrilled. Purple hair is Lisa, and this is Caroline.
Hello.
I like to color code, so the current styles in hair definitely speak to me, and I'm working some purple these days. The day before I left Boston, I put my front tire into a sinkhole of a pothole and limped to a venue that I hope is going to house the World Hearing Voices Congress in this coming August. And I kept thinking, I'm going to be in 100-degree heat, Fahrenheit. Also not translating very well there. And here I am, and I have got to say how thrilled I am to be here. And to be with one of my favorite partners in crime, Caroline. We'll get into fun stuff. It's really strange. We love talking about suicide. It is uplifting for us to do so. And we're really, really thrilled to have so many people come out to have those conversations with us.
Thanks. There's this quote by Albert Camus. Maybe some people have heard it. It goes, "In the midst of winter, I found within me there was an invincible summer." Now that's a quote we've talked about in alternatives to suicide groups before, usually about how sometimes in our darkest moments we can find this connection or a moment of vulnerability or a handhold that pulls us through. But for me it's like, now I understand it a lot more literally now, to actually fly from the midst of winter to this summer. And it's so beautiful to see so many people here. The topic of suicide should not be kept in small rooms in mental health facilities. It shouldn't be kept in designated areas. Suicide needs to be a community issue. Suicide is a social justice issue. Suicide is a human rights and a human issue. And it intersects with who we are spiritually and culturally. All those things are important. So it's wonderful to see such a large group here. I think that's really encouraging. And such a wide cross-section of people who are willing to enter into these conversations and in a new way.
One of the ways that our conversations around suicide began was our coming together within community of a bunch of people that oftentimes didn't even know what we were distressed about. We had spent many, many years being contained by systems that felt as though they were helping us out. And it took a long time to figure out exactly what the conversations were going to be. The traditional system responses to the topic of suicides is often that of clamping down and containing. What happens is that the conversation is not allowed, but of course the conversation still happens within us. So it makes a lot of sense that we started getting together and talking about those conversations that weren't being permitted in other realms of our worlds.
Cool. Yeah, so it's going to be really important for us to unpack some of the standard systemic responses to someone who brings up the topic of suicide. The reason why we do that, it's useful. It's useful to ask, hey, why have we been doing things this particular way? We've been doing them. But also, these approaches are what has informed alternatives to suicide. We wanted to truly create an alternative, a different kind of space, and we wanted to make sure that we weren't replicating particular things that were already out there. So the first thing that we're going to talk about that we don't really seek to replicate is risk assessment, a risk management approach where dialogue becomes an assessment. So I know I'm probably not the only one here who spent a lot of time in the mental health system. And what I noticed was when I was in sort of the system, The darkest moments of my life were often the ones where people became most detached with me. So when I was in a really tough place, considering ending my life, sometimes the conversation would end, and all of a sudden out would come these lists of questions. I don't know if some of you have heard these here in Australia, but do you have a plan? Do you have the means to carry out that plan? Are they lethal means? So here I was going through this huge crisis, incredibly vulnerable. But instead of being vulnerable with me, another person was kind of offering me these questions that they'd been told to ask. And a lot of the times they weren't about the deep issue that I was struggling with. For me, most of the time, suicide wasn't the problem itself. Suicide was my solution to some of the really tough stuff I had gone through, like sexual abuse, hearing a voice that was telling me that I couldn't make it, that I wasn't any good, the pressures of the society around me that women should be a certain way. So suicide wasn't actually my problem, but these types of risk assessment tools just become very narrow in their scope. Now, what's interesting is that despite their common use, risk assessment tools don't actually work very well. So I've had the opportunity to go to different conferences. I think at least one other person here was with me at the Suicidology conference in Atlanta. And despite the fact that risk assessment tools, they're very popular, a lot of people spend careers developing them, they have sort of leveled out in their effectiveness. So most risk assessment tools are accurate only about 50% of the time. And they've sort of stayed static in their accuracy since 1963. They haven't really improved. So people continue to use them despite the fact they can cause real disconnects and they're not necessarily accurate. So I could pull, one of those big coins you guys have with the queen on it and flip it. And it would be about as accurate as some of the most accurate risk assessment tools. So we want to talk about that because we want people to feel comfortable maybe moving away, stepping away from some of those lists of questions that maybe you think you're supposed to ask, and getting into deep curiosity with people. And that's what we do in our alternatives to suicide groups.
There are some bumpy things on the floor. I physically feel like I'm upside down. I didn't think I would, but I really do. So if I just kind of fall, somebody can pick me up, but you got me, right?
Yeah.
It's quite possible. Other system responses have a lot to do with pathologizing of one's experience. In my own experience, I actually found a therapist that I found very, very useful. The partnership was very close. And he was very real with me. I actually found out about who he was as a person, along with sharing of my struggles and what was going on for me. One of the things that he was required to do, however, was risk assessment. And I would get that list of questions. And it was kind of my non-compliant moment when I started telling Kevin that I had no intention of answering those questions anymore. And he was very respectful. He would get it out at that time. I guess he probably had a timeline by which he was supposed to do that to keep our relationship current according to the case files or whatever. And he would get it out and he would say, it's about that time. And I would say, my response is going to be the same as last time. And he said, I just have to get it out. And he'd scribble something on it and put it away. What happened then was the conversation stayed in that real place where I was talking to somebody named Kevin, and Kevin was speaking with somebody named Lisa. It was still limited to 50 minutes and any other contrivances that were hard for me, but it didn't lead to a pathologization of my experience. He didn't talk to me about my depression. He didn't talk to me about my erratic nature. He didn't use words that put me in a place of one down to his one up. I never felt a power struggle with him when I spoke with him, and I found that really, really helpful. However, when I started to have that same negotiation with my psychiatrist around backing off medications, the psychiatrist really needed to use all the labels that have been given to me to argue in defense of keeping me on those medications. It was really, really difficult because I was really having two very different conversations with the same agency, really, and wanted support out of seeing how I could stand without the crutches of these medications that, from my own place, I didn't really feel were all that helpful. Moreover, more and more research is showing that many of these medications increase thoughts around suicide. And I thought maybe that was part of what was keeping me stuck in my bedroom for months at a time. And that's definitely something that happens, is I would go from Kevin talking about my real life, and then I'd end up with my psychiatrist who was talking about me in a symptomatic fashion, when it made all the sense in the world that I was in pain, and that I was hurting, and that I was struggling in my existence. And then it didn't make any sense when I talked to my psychiatrist.
Yeah, I really love this slide. I know probably some people can't see the image because they're too far away, but it's an image of someone with a handful of pills, and the pills have words on them like love, truth, beauty. And what's been really what's profound about me for this image is so many of the people that I meet that attend the alternatives to suicide groups that I facilitate really are searching for things like purpose and meaning and connection in their lives. I know that I was. And unfortunately, the mental health system, it does some things well, but what it has not done well for a lot of us is provide things like meaning and purpose. My diagnosis of bipolar, borderline psychosis, was a lot of words, but it didn't really give me an identity that made me feel strong, like my roller derby name did, a Mazel Tov cocktail. And for a lot of people, they enter into services, deep down that's what they're looking for. They're trying to figure out, what does it mean to be a man? What does it mean to be a transgender man? How do I negotiate things like the pressures of racism or police brutality? What is my purpose on this planet? And those are things that a prescription we can't write for. Luckily, they are things that if we sit with others, share our stories, we can find things like connection, but it's not necessarily in a pill bottle, and that's what the mental health system, at least in my country, I know in your country, do you guys have ads for psych drugs on TV? Okay, I think we're uniquely messed up in that way. Yeah. So if you ever go to the US, it might be a little creepy for you to see some of those ads. But yeah, that's what's been offered. And it isn't necessarily what's going to pull us out of our dark place. In fact, a lot of the folks that I meet when they first come to alternatives to suicide groups are really stuck. They're in a really stuck place. If you ask them, if they come to group and they say, I'm feeling suicidal, usually I ask, well, what's going on? What's life like right now? And sometimes they'll be like, well, I'm manic, or I'm depressed, and I'll say, well, what does that mean? What's that like for you? How does it feel? What does it look like? And it will be like some of the first time people have ever thought about those things like, what is my situation beyond the diagnosis I've received? Who else am I? And so it is really helpful because, sometimes people come to groups and they've been stuck for years because they've been told, your solution is to find the right pill. They haven't found it, and they believe that they have to keep looking for one. But for a lot of folks, that's not their solution, or at least it's not the only one. So they really need to have more space than a 15-minute med check with a psychiatrist to figure out how to move forward in their lives. And luckily, groups like this can address that.
There are certainly data sets and stories told by the clinical world and the research world that very much influence the conversations that happen in our groups, that tell the story of why our groups have the conversations that they do. The ACE study, how many folks are familiar with the ACE study? There's a good, I want you all to come up and tell me, because when I try to verbalize this back, I always trip over it. But it was a really, really cool study. It was actually done by a mental health insurance company. I don't have a lot of favor for those, by the way. But what they did was they asked about what was going on in people's lives and followed them for a very good pack of years, and followed people and asked them by their own reporting what kind of things had happened to them in the time of this research piece. And they had really, really interesting correlations. Again, we have like a great word called trauma, or trauma-informed, or some fun little cliche words. But when something happens to you, it's meaningful. It impacts us in our bodies in ways that we can't verbalize, in ways that we can't consciously communicate. Those ways often get overlooked by a lot of our traditional responses. If we sit with somebody and just see how the day has gone, how the pets are behaving, whether the kid got through that stressful test that they were going to be taking, a lot of these issues will come up. Sometimes it's just listening to somebody else's story and realizing that a sexual trauma is kind of bringing things up in your body that you have no correlation for, no memory of, but you feel that uncomfortable and that strongly that you almost feel like you're sitting in the same place as the person speaking at the moment. That's profound. Like, I just gave myself a chill. I had a conversation recently with somebody where that was happening for them. And it was amazing to see that this conversation was going to happen for this person long after I was done my part in it. Because it was really impacting the way they conceptualize their own lives. ACE study is really, really wonderful. They're continuing that work. I think there's a follow-up that they're working on. But furthermore, there is a lot of studies coming out now around suicide in specific communities that are saying more and more that communities that are economically depressed have higher rates because of lack of opportunity, which makes all the sense in the world when you're in our groups and talking to folks about what they're struggling with day to day. Oh, yes. Scribble, scribble, scribble.
Yeah, definitely check out the ACE study if you're not familiar yet. A book that I really recommend is The Body Keeps the Score by Bessel van de Kolk. It's interesting. He talks at length about the ACE study. The guy that actually first did the ACE study, he wasn't a psychiatrist. He didn't work in mental health. He supported people who were dealing with obesity. And what happened was there was like a woman who lost a lot of weight, but then the next time he saw her, she had gained it all back in a way that he thought, at a rate that he thought was medically impossible. So he was like, what happened here? Like, what's going on? And the woman was like, she got really real with him and explained to him that she was an incest survivor. And when she lost all the weight, suddenly she was getting some attention from men that was really, really hard for her to deal with. And so she ate to deal with it. And what the guy that did the ACE study, Vincent Folletti, was like, I wonder how common this is. And he found that there was actually like huge rates, very high rates of abuse and trauma in the people that he was working with. So what was interesting for Vincent Folletti was here the problem that these people had was defined as obesity. Obesity is the problem, we need to treat their obesity. When the reality was there was a much deeper issue. And that's something that we see a lot. You know, for example, like when I was in the mental health system, the problem was defined like Caroline hears voices that other people don't, she cuts her skin, she's made a suicide attempt. Those are Caroline's problems, and we need to fix those problems. But if people had gone deeper, they would realize my problems were actually abuse. I was an abuse survivor. So it's really interesting because, you know, if we have people that are searching and searching for the biomarker, right? The chemical imbalance, the biomarker that causes, you know, mental illness. And really the research has not panned out despite the investment of like billions of dollars. But here we have studies like this one, and I know not everyone can read this. We have a study that shows that if you have 6 or more traumatic events in your childhood, that your rate of committing suicide increases by 5,000% in adulthood. 5,000%. If there was a product on the market, if there was a chemical compound out there that made someone 5,000% more likely to try to end their lives, we would ban it. We would do something about it, right? But so many people haven't heard about this study despite the fact that it's been replicated, and the original study was on 16,000 people. So you don't see those kind of results. You know, you don't see that sample size ever, right, in like a pharmaceutical trial. So this stuff is really important, but it's just not acknowledged. So like one last example, I had a young woman that came, she's become a very regular member of a couple alternative to suicide groups that I facilitate. She had attempted suicide 3 times in a month and had to have like her stomach pumped like multiple times. Finally, her professor, she was really lucky, her professor was Dr. Gail Hornstein, who I think some of you know. Her professor was like, try going to these groups instead. Like, try this. And, you know, it was really interesting. She took part in the group and really loved it. And she said, you know, I have been in the psych ward so many times. I have all these suicide attempts, and never once did they ask me why. Why did you try to end your life? No one asked me what was going on until I came to this group. And then I was able to talk about the fact that I'd been raped in my dorm room. And people supported me and told me, you know, that they had had a similar experience and held me and told me it wasn't my fault and that I was loved. That conversation didn't happen in the system itself. And so we urge people, you know, regardless of what our role is, we can open ourselves to conversations about trauma and what has happened in people's lives that have brought them to where they are. And it is definitely supported by research. Check out Bessel van der Kolk's book, because it also has a lot of encouraging data on the things that work to help people move through trauma. Pharmaceuticals are not actually seen, haven't panned out yet that they found one that truly mitigates the effect of trauma, but there's a lot of great things out there. Neurofeedback, EMDR, internal family systems, yoga, singing in a choir. I believe roller derby helps, but that study has not been done yet. So this is not, these statistics, it's not like a death sentence. There's ways to heal. Oh, that was mine too.
You were on a roll. You keep going.
So when I said at the beginning that suicide is a social justice issue, data supports that as well. So when we look at who, and I think these are rates from the United States. In our country, our indigenous, our First Nations people have a rate of suicide that is twice the rate of the rest of the population. Gay and transgender folks in our country, gay teens are 8.4% more likely to have an attempt. Trans people, 40% of trans folks in our country have attempted suicide at some point. And our veterans have an exceedingly high rate as well. So when we're talking about suicide, it's really important to remember these issues. I recently did, I think it was the first Hearing Voices training ever that was specifically for veterans. And I learned a lot hanging out with those folks. And, one of the really important things is, instead of labeling people as broken or ill, maybe we need to start talking about the way we fight wars, the number of wars we fight. In my country, there are people doing 3-4 tours of duty and coming back to very little support. Maybe instead of talking about mental illness all the time, we need to talk about the way our culture treats gender non-conforming people. In the groups that I facilitate, we have a very, tons of folks that attend that identify as LGBTQ, and they need that space. So for a lot of folks, what they find appealing about alternatives to suicide is they can have conversations about these social issues. And I also have a lot of folks that tell me oh, well, men don't attend support groups. And I found that's kind of a lot of crap. Men attend the alternatives to suicide groups. I just don't think men like to attend groups where they're told that they have a broken brain and they're mentally ill. And I think there's a lot of groups of people like that. So if we can provide these spaces where, we can have discussions about racism, transphobia, war. In the groups we're doing right now, I haven't done a single group since November 9th of 2016 where people didn't talk about their fear living in the current political climate we do in the United States. And that's critical. Our groups, we need to be having these types of conversations as well. Otherwise, we're ignoring a lot of the things that are causing people to feel deep pain and wounds.
Yeah, I guess the only thing I have to add to that is our current response to thoughts around suicide is generally to isolate that somehow, isolate the person, isolate the thought process. And suicide simply does not happen in isolation. So I think our gut system response is erring in that way. It is almost as though suicide exists between us in a lot of ways, that the pain that we experience in our daily lives, being female, being of color, being non-conforming, having just lost a job when you were raised to have a job for your entire life to support your family. All of these things do not exist separately from our thoughts around suicide. And when we separate those things, we only exasperate what's going on for somebody. When that happens, essentially everything hits the fan, right? What's the system's next response? We use force. we start to make decisions for the person. We'll put them in the hospital against their will. We'll take their personal belongings from them. We'll isolate them further in a little cubicle that we roust up every 15 minutes for a check. And somehow that's supposed to keep somebody from thinking about the only thing they're thinking about. And that's our system response. There was a time, actually I was already working with our community, and I was feeling really, really alone in my existence, I guess. I wasn't alone day to day, but I felt very alone in my existence. And I was on the telephone with my mother, and I kind of made the mistake of letting her know that I had taken advantage of a prescription off-label. That meant overdose to her. It wasn't, but that's what she understood it to be. She called the police, and in the United States, the police will come and do a well check. My well check ended in me being restrained on my bed, face down, being handcuffed and dragged to the hospital. And that was my mother caring for me. You know, the whole thing started with somebody that I trusted that was worried about me. I now have such a body-wide response to a man in uniform, I can't even tell you. And that's what our response is. And it's really interesting because I'm seeing all these heads nodding, and we're all like, well, of course, that's ridiculous that we do that. And yet that is, you know, in the progression of how we respond to thoughts of suicide, a fairly common occurrence.
Yeah, I literally could not count the number of people that come to an Alternatives to Suicide group for the first time, and they say, you know, I haven't talked about this stuff in years. I haven't talked about this since X happened, since the time I was in jail, and I talked about suicide, and they took all my clothes away. Since that time, I spoke about suicide, and the police showed up and kicked in my door. What people don't say is that I stopped thinking about suicide after those things happened. What people say is I stopped talking about them. So that's critical for me, because the last thing we want is for people to be holding these thoughts and these issues in silence. So we need to reckon with the fact that maybe some of the approaches are contributing to silence. And we need to ask why, and what are some other things that we can offer. I really encourage people, if you're not familiar with peer respite, that's something we have in the US. We have a great little film. I don't know if we'll get a chance to show it during our week here, as much as I'd love to, but it is available online. It's an alternative to going to the hospital, a place where you can stay and get 24-hour peer support. Yeah, go ahead. And one of the reasons why it's so critical to have places like this is data like this one. This is a study, I don't know if this is the Hong Kong or the Sweden, but it doesn't matter because these results have been replicated in almost every Western country in the world, and now obviously in some Asian countries, that suicide risk actually increases quite substantially during hospitalization, as well as in the 2 weeks after discharge. And this is fairly well known. You know, when I've been to suicidology conferences before, there's a lot of people with, you know, fancy degrees that are talking about this, and they're like, we need to do the studies to figure out why this happens. And I'm like, great, y'all work on that. But while you are figuring out why, it might be a really good idea to have alternatives. You know, to have a space other than, you know, this hospital where we've demonstrated risk increases. So that means, more alternatives to suicide groups, more crisis alternatives, retreat centers. Like, I'm someone that I won't go back to the hospital again. I've done my time, months on end. But sometimes I do go through periods where I need more support. So I've been to peer respites. I've also been to spiritual retreat centers, like places where I can go where it's less of a clinical setting, but I can still like move through a really dark time.
Yeah, I had a thought, and then we were discussing slides, so I lost my thought a little bit. But I think it's really interesting, in the development of our community, I so appreciated everybody speaking before us, because we kind of got a lay of the land and who all has come together and partnered to bring us here. And you all did something that happens in the U.S. quite frequently too, and our community was referred to as a center several times, and so I would be remiss if I didn't say we're a community first. Our dear companion and what is she? Our warrior.
Yeah.
Our
Wonder Woman.
Would be concerned if she would be concerned if we didn't point that out. That we are first and foremost community. And some of the things that Caroline mentioned around having a pure respite to go to, these alternative approaches have all sprung out of our community. So not only has this approach sprung out, but all the different things that people find work have been supported as well. Sometimes they're spiritual approaches or holistic approaches. We have dietary groups, yoga groups, acupuncture groups, Reiki. We have the pure respite. We have people called bridgers that actually go into hospitals and support people in that transition time when we all kind of hit the wall and say, holy crap, I'm going to be responsible for myself again. Maybe I'll just call it quits now, so that we can hold each other's hands and remember our humanity as we come back into our communities, and remind each other that we have our own systems that we've put in place. They're called human connection, and that through that human connection, we are all stronger. And that's how our community is now a decade old, and strangely enough, we're standing in Australia talking about it. All of the stuff that we're talking about today, we didn't design for you all. We designed because we hurt. We investigated because we were curious about what could possibly be different. When we were aware of the things that didn't work for us. When time and time again, we would think about ending our lives, and one more thing would be ticked off our list of availability. Sorry, I'm not going to be able to talk to mom anymore because she calls the police. That one's down now. I don't love her any less, but that's not something I can use her for now. And all of those things, especially I was coming out of a marriage, so I had a marriage that was falling apart, and young children trying to figure out how to depend on parents that weren't getting along, and all of the difficulty that has, and all of my own supports were dropping away, and I fell into this community and discovered all these amazing people having many of the same struggles, but the whole thing ended up feeling entirely reframed and refreshed for me. I didn't feel like the odd man out. My pain was validated in so many ways, and little by little, as our community matured, we did things like make a peer respite actually happen, and we're able to rejoice as a strong community saying we have this available for ourselves now. And it's just an amazing feeling to be here in Australia now talking about this, when really I thought I was a housewife with a failed marriage trying to figure out how I was going to live on my disability check when this all came about for me. So I want to thank you all again for coming out, and hope we have offered you a couple words that you've written down or will inspire a little more curious investigation throughout the day today. And do we have time? I think
there's one more thing I'm going to add.
Okay.
There's just one more thing I'm going to add, and then we can totally take questions until tea time. So in my country, we don't have tea time. We are, however, one of the most litigious, if not the most litigious countries in the world. So when I talk about alternatives to suicide groups, in the United States, I'll often have people say, yeah, you're right. You're right about the rates of suicide increasing post-discharge, and now we know during hospitalization. But I'm very limited because of my licensure. If someone were to act and, I might be held liable for that. And so actually both my parents are lawyers. I have like a family full of them. It's terrible. But we've done some of the research, and alternatives to suicide approach and peer supports in general are a great way in the United States to really deal with some of those fears. So in the United States, actually like looking at the case law and talking to attorneys, even in the US, if you are a non-prescribing outpatient clinician, I'm sure there's some of you here, even in the United States, your risk of being held liable over someone's suicide are about the same as being struck by lightning. It's very rare. These cases happen. I'm sorry if there are any psychiatrists in the room. You tend to be the ones where cases are brought, at least in my country. But in terms of peer support, in terms of alternatives to suicide, where we have a charter that indicates that we're not providing any kind of medical treatment. This is a place where we share our stories and connect with one another. That risk is zero. There's never been, in all of case law, even in the entire history of Alcoholics Anonymous in the United States, where someone in a peer support had sort of role or setting has been held liable for someone else's action. And so this is very soothing to like American audiences. I don't know if it's something that is applicable in this country, but it's something that we found to like get around things, so that oftentimes therapists in the Pioneer Valley where I live, and we have many of these groups, will say to the person they're supporting, if you continue to go down this line of conversation, I may have to commit you. And I'm happy to have the conversation, and if you want to go to the hospital, that's fine, and we can make that happen. However, if you want to keep talking about this topic in this level of detail, and you don't want to go to the hospital, here's some information about these groups. Here's where they meet, here's Caroline's phone number, here's how you get there. Go ahead and check them out. So it's something, this has been a way for us to sort of like develop, like a way around not only like the system, but also the legal system too. So it's been really effective because I talk to a lot of therapists or service providers that feel really stuck around this issue and frustrated, and I think it's so unfortunate because I think a lot of them could have really great conversations around this topic where they really explore with people what's going on and the ways forward, but they're limited in some way. So more of these groups is a great thing because they don't have those same limitations. Yes. Yes.
Yeah. Thank you so much. That presentation, I'm sure I'm speaking on behalf of most people here, is just fantastic. That combination of the personal and the professional and the different approaches. We are running early, which is wonderful, so we do have time for questions in this half before we go to the tea. Leah is offered to run around for us with the roving mic. So what I get you to do is, can you wave your hand madly if you want to ask a question? When you do get the mic, can you identify yourself, introduce yourself at the beginning, because that will be helpful for us to know where you come from. Can you also place it really close to your mouth, otherwise I may be forced to come down and do it for you. And please, just having been to a lot of conferences, you know where people have got the mic off and you want the whole room to hear the question? And please keep your question sort of succinct. So can I just see where we do have questions in the room? So we've got someone, oh yes, beautiful, oh, you get the prize of going first. Can we go over there first, please, Leah?
My name's Dale Jones. I work with the Alcohol and Drug Support Line, telephone counselling with the Mental Health Commission.
Hi, Dale.
I've got two questions. First one being, we're often advised as a telephone counsellor to don't go into the story. And I think it's really pertinent here because we do exactly that when we get suicide calls. Someone's expressing suicide ideation, have you got a plan, have you done it before, all that typical stuff that we've been trained to do. Could you please offer some suggestions or around that from your perspective?
Yeah, jump on that. Sure. So yeah, this is really about human stories, right? Every person I meet that wants to end their life has a story, has a very rich story that includes pain, but also points of light, unique strengths. So it's like curiosity is important. When we train our facilitators, we do train our facilitators to ask questions, but we don't train them to ask those particular questions. We train our facilitators to say things like, what's going on in your life? Have you felt this way before? Is there something in your life that you need that you aren't getting right now? One of the big ones we talk about is, as a voice here, I have heard voices that told me to end my life. What's been important at those times is to realize that often my voices speak in metaphor. So there may be something in my life that does need to end, but it's not that my heart needs to stop beating. You know what I mean? So like relationships. My relationship with heroin, for example, needed to end for me to go on living. So we ask questions like that. Is there something in your life that needs to end? But also a big one, big question would be, how long have you felt this way? Sometimes people will say, I felt this way for 20 years. And then from there you can ask, your survival is amazing then. What has kept you going? Like what have been the thing, like essentially, why haven't you killed yourself? Is actually a really profound conversation to have. And you'll really get to know like what people's strengths are. It might be, we talk about cats a lot in groups. I can't even count how many people have stayed alive because of a cat. But also a spiritual path, a role, a child. So it's so important when we're talking about this stuff that we're also talking about strength and identity and like what has kept people here. And yeah, that's a story, and we want to know people's story and all the different, like the constellation of people's lives.
Thank you. I just wanted to make a note that we're often told as telephone counsellors not to go into the story so much because it's better for it to be done on a face-to-face environment so it can be contained a lot more. That might be a question. Could you respond to that, or would it be this? What do you think?
Yeah, I think our telephone lines are really very telling of our system response in general. A lot of telephone operators, support people will burn out because they get this sense that they can't do enough, that they themselves are incredibly contained and limited. So we actually have a curriculum that we offer to telephone folks called When Conversation Turns to Suicide. And we do that, we offer that in collaboration with the power structure of the phone bank to really change the culture of how we're responding to folks that are in pain and distress. And figuring out, testing out our own individual comfort with being in difficult conversation. How flexible and resilient are we at staying in that conversation? And what that means, whether it's in face or on a telephone. A lot of our in-person conversations are about making appointments anyway. We'll end up saying, you know, this has been a great conversation, can we pick this back up at such and such a time? Absolutely capable, you know, telephones, absolutely. It's really, really difficult for me personally when there's a strange little social media campaign to spread the 1-800 number, the toll-free number in the US, because I don't know whether that phone call is monitored. I don't know whether if they use a risk assessment model. I don't know if they have caller ID and they can send somebody to the person's address. If any of those things are true, I can't, in good conscience, refer somebody that number. So it is part of our cultural change, I think, about how we're going to be responding to suicide and the pain that really is what it's all about.
Thank you. Just one other question. Have you heard of the Spiritual Crisis Network?
I'm just going to nip up
Yes.
because we need to move on. Sorry, I do understand you've got more questions, but let's go to our next question down the back, and then we've got someone in the middle. Sorry to keep looping up.
Thank you.
Hi, my name's Jodie. I just wanted to ask, and everyone in general who's in the room, I was in the system for 17 years and attempted, my ex-husband leaves at least 30 times. Not once during that system, besides being locked up, was I offered this sort of help across all the hospitals I went to in Perth, and I'm just wondering if anyone in the room knew of such a support network over those years. Might have saved my marriage and my relationship with my daughter, so I'm glad I didn't succeed, but yeah, I was just wondering if anyone knew about any system that was out there at that time.
I don't know about the resources in Perth. I do want to say though, like in terms of like the telephone stuff, like I think that for a lot of folks, like telephone and online, I mean, that's the future, right? So I'm tasked with bringing like the Hearing Voices Network to a country that is massive. It's like has 40 times the land mass of like the UK. And I have a sense that you guys might have a lot of people in your country too that might not live near an in-person support group. Maybe. So I think that looking at online, like I recently, with a friend of mine, we started like the first online Hearing Voices group, and it's been really great for people in our country that live in places like Wyoming, which is like the bushland of America. And yeah, what I found is that it can be really powerful. You can get really deep, and that there's great benefit to that. And for some people, that might be the only option they have. So I'm grateful to those people that do the phone lines and the online stuff, because for some folks, they're not going to be able to share their story in any other capacity.
Good morning. My name's Andrew Markovs. I'm amongst many hats. I'm Principal Master Trainer for Mental Health First Aid and One Life Suicide Prevention Gatekeeper Program. As a welcome, by the way, I'm based in Albany, so it's your sister city from your next door neighbour state. And yes, Caroline, we do actually have a roller derby women's team in tiny little Albany. I wanted to ask you about one of the many notes I took, which is the treatment becomes trauma comment. The most important hat I'm wearing at the moment is actually as the nominated person, which is something under the West Australian Mental Health Act, for a very dear family member who is an involuntary patient. I've been watching or feeling this trauma becoming treatment over the last week at every single one of the interviews between the patient and the psychiatrist, and it's like a vicious circle. The reaction of the patient seems to fuel the clinical fire of the psychiatrist, and there's this almost a battle going on between them, i.e. let's call it the natural reaction, as you had both spoken about, and I think most of us in the room would feel, seems to be a trigger for the clinician to go more and more down that biomedical model. It's not a question I expect you to answer, but any comments on how to break that cycle, please?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. And although alternatives to suicide groups don't take place on locked units, I do visit a locked unit every week to provide peer support. And I think that can make a huge difference. So for us, yeah, like I know I've been in the hospital long term, and it's really, really hard. It's weird. It's like I was in there because I was struggling, with abuse and trauma. And here I was, like, I had to sleep on this like plastic mattress with a roommate that was like crying all the time. And some weird dude would come in my room and shine a flashlight in my face every 15 minutes. And I'm like, this doesn't make any sense. This is how I'm supposed to heal? Like, this is how I get better? I don't even have a belt. So what we've done at the RLC is we go onto units like that one and make sure that even if people don't have a choice over what they eat, even though they don't have a choice whether they're there or not when they get to leave, that there is at least some spaces where they can be themselves, talk about whatever they want, and no one's taking a note on it. It's not going to be taken to the treatment team meeting, that we have these little pockets of peer support that are available. And part of that, like when I stepped into that role, has been learning some of the legal parts of how people get committed and forcibly medicated. We have a lot of that in our country. So making sure that sometimes I invited an attorney to my peer support groups that were in a separate area and not attended by hospital staff, so that people could get real answers to their legal questions about how do I get out of here? What's the best way to get off a forced medication order? What are my options? And it's certainly, in some days, most days it feels like being a Band-Aid on a bullet hole, honestly. But it's something. And I keep going back because people say, the only reason I can stand to be here is that I know folks from the RLC will show up and we can talk and we can laugh together, and it makes a small difference. So yeah, these conversations can happen in really difficult environments, and it's important that they do.
Yeah, I'd like to add that I appreciate that you're witnessing these conversations. I think it's really, really important. Also, what Caroline's talking about is agency and one's individual sense of agency. As we get swallowed by these systems, we inadvertently hand over our sense of agency. The professionals know what they're talking about, that kind of stuff. It's a very slippery slope, and it happens quite quickly. Oftentimes in peer relationship, what happens is that sense of agency starts to take its hold again. And if you have these spaces where you can talk from your real self and share your real fears, and they may very well be about the staff that has power over you, you can really get a sense of what your needs are and express them. And if you've got somebody that can be responsive to that, bring a lawyer in, or have witness conversations with the carers, that can really move you to a different place. And then the things that happen, like in your case, I suspect the psychiatrist is seeing behaviors and doing, somebody holding their own sense of agency is going to behave differently. What happens a lot of times when we hold groups and things like that on locked units is somebody that holds those spaces will start to hear from the staff members, what are you guys doing in there? Everybody's much happier and not as much of a problem, and this one behavior, I'm not seeing it anymore. And you can start to have conversations with the people and the staff members about how they are doing their work, because they start to see that our work is so effective.
Next question with Chris's mic.
Hello, I'm Antonella. I'm the CEO of Connect Groups. We're the peak body for support groups in WA, and I really welcome all the comments that you're making. For the last 8 years, we've been advocating of the incredible role that support groups play right across early intervention, prevention, and recovery. And but what we've had to do for the last 8 years is change the word. We cannot say that we're an alternative to recovery. We say we're complementary to that recovery. So there's 600 groups in WA which are not specifically mental health, but what we know is that regardless of the condition, there's an overarching mental health. So I so welcome hearing you speak so favorably, because I think there's a role here, again in WA, to utilize our many support groups to support that journey. So thank you.
Lovely.
Thanks.
Thank you so much for those comments, and thank you especially for bringing out the conversation about the language that we use. It is incredibly important, and I think we're using this language because we know it's a common language and everybody will kind of get it. When we're hanging out with folks in our groups, it's whatever language they're using.
Got a question down the back.
Hello. Oh, sweet.
Way back there.
Hi. How's it going? My name's Trudy. I've been in now the service for God knows how long, but that's too long a story. I was just looking at your core values and stuff. The thing that really impresses me is the no red tape. Now I know in this room there are a lot of psychologists, psychiatrists. See a lot of familiar faces, and all I can think about is referral process. Wait lists. Sick of hearing that. So I haven't really got a question. I'm just going to make a major statement to everyone in the room. Get rid of your wait lists. Obviously this works. You know. If we could do more of this in Perth, it would be amazing. Because like, I've been waiting to get into DBT for over a year. I got a phone call end of last year saying, we can get you into a course in January. I said, I'm going to New Zealand for a holiday. I will call you when you get back. Didn't hear anything. Made a phone call. Oh, we'll get on to it. That was February, beginning. Still haven't heard a thing. So, for the organisations that are in the room, make sure you follow up on your referrals. Try and maybe cut down the whole referral bullshit, really. You know, there's people out there like me that need support, and you guys are the ones that need to supply it for us. So, yeah, just cut the crap and get down to business. Thanks.
Hello, my name's Natalie Arnott. I'm actually studying at the moment. I'm doing a Cert 3 Community Services. Basically, I'm just here to try and get, obviously, more knowledge. It's a bit scary for me talking in front of so many people because I've been out of work for so long. Basically, I just want to kind of add to what you're saying. I have a little 11-year-old boy in my care. Now, he's my nephew, but I didn't know him as he was growing up. And it's, for me, it kind of scared me to start with, but I think especially with the kids, what I'm seeing is you can't put them in a spot and say, tell me what you're thinking, or what is your issue, or things like that. He will tell me things, and they're horrific things, while he's playing the PlayStation. Now that just, I was like, whoa, because to me, he's awesome on PlayStation, so I thought he'd be using all his brain for the PlayStation, but he's not. And I think that's what we've got to realise, is there's things going on in the minds, especially the kids, all the time. And I think that's where it leads to more issues socially as well. So yeah, just it obviously the relationships that he does build with me or my family, and the fact that he is feeling comfortable and the trust is there, and he is willing to talk, but you need the situation to be right, because if it's not, when he goes to his counsellor, or he doesn't talk because he doesn't feel like talking, or it's not on his mind. So I just think we have to be aware you can't pin someone down to talk about their issues.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for that comment. It's especially true of children, but it's true of all of us. I think Caroline's worked stuff out on roller derby. I like to go down ski mountains very quickly, regardless of barriers. I work a lot out when that happens. First-person games online where you have a mic, the conversation is not always about the game, and some amazing things get worked through in that case. And kids know when they're being scrutinized. They're smarter than we are. They really are. And they understand when conversations are threatening to them. So building that trust is first and foremost with all of us, I think, but with kids especially. And you are in a treasured place to have his trust. So thank you for those comments.
I really like playing video games too, and I don't feel bad about it at all, because there's so many people that, like, that was our point of connection. You know, like, I never would have, started talking to someone and getting to know their story if we couldn't connect over, like, Pokemon or Fallout 4 first. Yeah. So, yeah, I think that's really powerful.
I'm a worker in the industry, but I was just wanted to know about, like, you were talking about the alternatives to suicide as being a space where people can talk about, stuff without being judged and rated and whatever else. But as a worker in the industry, we are geared up, I suppose, for that, and maybe it's all to do with duty of care and all that sort of stuff, for assessing that risk of suicide. And like you said, obviously the deeper issues behind that. But at a workplace, you don't have that indulgence, I suppose, or which is the wrong choice of words, but of actually being able to go into that story for whatever reasons. So I feel a bit limited. I've been to suicide workshops before, and what I felt is it's all about the risk, and you find out the person's suicidal, and then you go, how important it is to find out if they're suicidal, and then kind of what do you do with them? You know what I mean? Because it is go to the hospital or whatever else. So I suppose my sort of question is, is that you're limited in as a worker because of that duty care and because of the, you're trying to find out that core thing of whether the person is suicidal. But where do we go as a worker? You can always, like I said, if this is set up in WA or Australia or whatever, then that does give an option. But it's not really set up like that here at the moment. I suppose everyone's too scared that someone's going to say they're suicidal, and then the risk is high, and they're going to go off and do something, and they're going to be responsible. So that gives you those support groups, give you that option of people can talk around it. But I don't think there's really much around in WA. So as a worker at this point in stage, how could we be helped in that respect?
One of the reasons why we provide for you folks in the beginning here with so many research studies and where to find more is because we know that some of you are likely going to need to be change agents where you work. I know in a peer role, that's a lot of what I've had to do. Sit down in some of these best practices meetings, like at the hospital we were talking about, You know, the risk, what's tough is I see people being validated so much for risk management and not much for being great connectors. For example, at the hospital where I'm in a peer role, there was a beautiful tree. People hardly ever got to go outside, but there was one completely enclosed courtyard. And the walls were hideous, and you were definitely locked in, but it had this one gorgeous tree. But then one day someone was like, hey, wait a minute. You know a branch could fall from that tree, right? It could hit someone on the head, and that's a risk. And they were like, oh my God, oh my God, oh my God. And now this beautiful tree is now a stump. So we know, right, the power that nature can have to heal people. We know that in our bones, yet that tree was cut down. So I think for a lot of us, yeah, it's about going back and looking at our values. Are we about managing people, risk management, and taking responsibility for people? Or rather, do we have a responsibility to people to be curious and compassionate, but not control? And so I think if we go back and we start to have some of these conversations, it might be kind of scary. It's scary to say things that are new and ask to do things in a different way. But there's a lot of research now that would support some of these changes. So that's why we offer some of these tools, because we know not everyone here is in a peer role. And you don't have to be in a peer role to make change. I mean, you could make a difference in someone's life by just taking an extra 10 minutes before you call the crisis wagon. You know, an extra 10 minutes to really explore who this person is could make a difference. Like I remember there was someone who was supporting me in a psych facility I lived in. And I remember, one time we were having a conversation and she called me responsible. And I was 25 years old at the time. And what she didn't know was that was the first time in my life that anyone had ever called me responsible. She pointed out a strength in me. She took the time to do that. And I'm talking about it now, a decade later. And so just to remember that you can make a big difference regardless of your role. And all it starts with is just a slight change in values.
Yeah, the one thing I would also offer to that is it has a lot, it comes back to that sense of agency again. We're dealing with adult human beings that have managed to get through rather large segments of their lives all by themselves. And we kind of infantilize folks when we bring them onto units. And it can happen in a brief conversation with a checklist. It happens, boom. And strangely, what that does to the care provider is it puts such a large weight on your shoulders. You now have the responsibility of another adult that you barely know. And that all by itself should be reason for pushback. To go to your agencies, to look at your protocols and say why? And can this be different? And why is this in place? Who put it there? Does it hold any veracity in today's world? Does it do us any good? Do we have examples where this is a useful tool? Sometimes what happens is help isn't help anymore. Maybe it was when the protocol was originally designed, but it's fallen so far away from that it doesn't help anybody in the dynamic at all. And so a lot of those conversations, if you find trusted environments in your workplace, and sometimes that's very difficult to do, a small clutch of people can start to zero in on some small changes that will really affect how you can do your job and how you can begin to be with people. And maybe we can save a couple trees in the process.
Hi, my name's Sarah, and I'm a peer support worker, so I'm in a peer role. But I have found on a couple of occasions in the past that I've had to rely on these systems that I don't support, such as doing welfare checks and things like that through the police, simply because I didn't know about any other alternatives. So, like an example, there was one when I was very, very early on in my role where somebody just pretty much called me up to say goodbye, because he had a plan, he was going through with it, blah, blah, blah. And I didn't know what else to do. So this is sort of what's ingrained in us right at the beginning is, if there is no other option, you call the police. Do you know of anything else that you think that you would have done in that situation?
Yeah.
You're nodding a lot. Go for it.
Oh, I've been in similar situations. I think it can also be wonderful to come from a place of curiosity in that situation. So in situations like that, one thing that I've said is, I'm just curious, can I ask, why you chose to call me? Why did you call today? It sounds like you're really in this determined place to take this action, and I'm just wondering why then you chose to reach out to me. Can we talk about what that is? And have a conversation about our relationship and what it means. What did it mean that you didn't act? You wanted to talk. You wanted to spend more time in conversation with another living human being. And that's been a really powerful shift. Another powerful shift that I've made in conversations is my own vulnerability. So a lot of us are trained to wear this kind of mask, and I don't really know who that helps. I don't think it helps the person wearing the mask, because I think a lot of folks struggle. There's a high rate of suicide among doctors, I think, because of that mask. And it doesn't help the person that we're wearing the mask in front of really much either, because it puts this high standard of humanity. There's something inauthentic about it, and I think people know. So in conversations like that one, sometimes it's been so powerful to say how I would be impacted. I am scared right now. I feel sad. I don't want to lose you. This is really hard for me. I feel like I need to support right now. This is more than I can hold. And sometimes it can be, talking to that person and figuring out, what do we do about this together? Because it's not about one person. At the end of the day, with peer roles especially, it's about the relationship. And what can we do in this relationship to make it work for both of us?